Welcome back, gamers. Today we're going to be talking about Crota's End, and more specifically, a refresher guide to the current version we have available in Destiny 1. Now, to be upfront, while having a reminder on how the raid works in Destiny 1 will be very helpful, keep in mind that nothing is set in stone and is subjected to change once the raid goes live in Destiny 2 on September 1st. Knowing the raid will come in handy, but it likely won't solve the new versions to these encounters automatically. But with that being said, let's dive into the raid. Your first encounter will be dropping into the Abyss and traversing your way to the top leading to the bridge. This is a very dark encounter, literally, so you might want to up your brightness for this in Destiny 2 for the sake of your eyes. You begin with a lamp in front of you slightly at a distance. This will be your main mechanic to this encounter. There are 15 lamps to use in the encounter, but technically speaking, you don't have to use all of them. Lamps are utilized to cleanse a debuff called Weight of Darkness, which triggers on you anytime that you are away from an active lamp. This debuff starts at 1 and builds all the way up to 10. This is a very similar debuff in the Lightblade strike in Destiny 2, where you must go from lamp to lamp while being slowed by a debuff. Now, the good news is that getting 10x Weight of Darkness won't kill you, so you won't have to be in a panic to never reach 10. However, what it does is make you slower than a snail and allows the enemies to pick you off. Now, speaking of these enemies, this encounter is filled with hordes and waves of Thrall, both regular and cursed, and there's some Hive Knights sprinkled in leading up to the bridge as well. Lastly, before we talk about the bridge, there's also a ton of holes to fall into at various points of the Abyss as you're traveling from lamp to lamp. So again, having your brightness upped to see these holes better is probably for the best. Now, as for the bridge portion to end this encounter, the way this works in Destiny 1 is once you've reached the bridge and touched the plate, the final phase begins where the plate will start forming the bridge. Your only objective here is to survive long enough until the bridge is formed for you to cross. Now, I know what some of you are already thinking. Well, Sneak, why won't we just shatter skate or well skate across? I would not bother with trying that. Most likely there'll be a turn back kill barrier that'll just eat up one of your revives. The other point to make here is that there's this infamous rock that you stand on once you trigger the plate. The rock is infamous for being safe from incoming Thrall, as their melee attacks can't reach you anymore. Cursed Thrall can't get close enough to explode, and then Sword Knights also are out of melee range. The only thing that can hurt you here are either wizards or ogres, but this can be nullified either through just using your weapons or just popping a Titan bubble on yourself and having a small picnic while the bridge finishes. After the plate is finished, the bridge is now formed and you can run off into the sunset to complete the Abyss encounter and head to the actual bridge encounter. Let's talk about the bridge. This encounter is very cooperation based and is fundamental in completing the objective, so you're going to want everyone on the same page here and communicating throughout. Your objective for this encounter are two main goals. Goal 1 is to set up 3 Guardians on plates in order to start forming a bridge. This is slightly different from the Abyss because this time around you cannot get off the plates after you've stepped on. Otherwise, the Annihilator totems activate and start glowing red. The only way to stop this is for either all players to get off their respective plates, or the player that got off of their spot gets back on. Otherwise, the Annihilator totem will continue to shriek and glow until it eventually wipes your team. Also worth noting that there will be plenty of Thrall and Acolytes trying to take you down, so don't get too comfortable thinking you'll have to just stand there on a plate and that's it. Now, while that's happening, your second goal is to acquire a sword from a Hive Swordbearer that'll spawn in on the first side of the bridge. This is the side where you spawned in. Once you defeat the Swordbearer, he will drop a Hive Relic sword, which then one of your players can pick up. You use this sword to travel across the bridge that your team has formed, and you must cross to take on a Gatekeeper Sword Hive Knight. Now, there's 2 things to note here. First is you need the sword to cross the bridge, otherwise the game will try to kill you. Second, while it's in your best interest to kill the Gatekeeper with your sword, it's not mandatory and can be cleaned up by the next person crossing the bridge if you need to. I only note this in the event that you think your life is in danger and you should consider retreating to survive, because this encounter is very brutal in untimely deaths, at least for Destiny 1. And one last thing to note, the Hive Relic Sword, Big Slam here, the M2 or the right trigger in this case, can instantly stun these Gatekeepers, so as long as you get in the first shot, you can perma-stun them until you eventually kill them, assuming there's no other enemies trying to hit you all at the same time. Once your team has completed this process 3 times, and now have a fire team on both sides of the bridge, your 3 players that have crossed the bridge can now get on their own set of plates and repeat the same ritual, while the first 3 players that have not crossed yet can get off of theirs. The same ritual applies here. Stay on your plates, don't get off until necessary, and make sure that the Annihilator totems don't wipe you while your other 3 players are getting their swords to cross the map. Now, once you've gotten 5 players successfully across the bridge, the final portion of this encounter begins, and more Hive Relic swords spawn in the arena. Your 6th player can now just cross the bridge by themselves, as it'll be fully formed by its own, and then you can pick these swords up and go to town on the hive and have a whole sword fiesta, if you will. You'll have to clear hive until eventually several gatekeepers will start spawning in, and you'll have to defeat those as well, which will then complete the encounter and open up the door to Shrieker Hell. Now for this next hallway section, I'm not going to touch on this much at all, as it'll very likely be straightforward. Nuke the Shriekers, break any barrier that you see that is up, and then zoom across as fast as you can. There's also a secret chest here at the end if you're quick enough, and will be getting sealed shut by a door slowly if you're too slow. And now a word from our sponsor. Just kidding, there is no sponsor. This is just a segue for me to ask you guys to like, share, and subscribe to help the channel grow and beat the algorithm. It is much appreciated, and it does help the channel. Alright, back to Crota. Moving along to the Death Singer encounter. As most of you know by now, we know for a fact that this encounter is getting changed based on the Crota's and raid trailer Bungie released themselves. So take what we currently have to do in Destiny 1 for this encounter with a grain of salt, but here we go. This encounter is pretty straightforward. You split up and nuke all the hive that you see. Nuking the hive will then trigger a Shrieker to open up on the inside left and inside right chambers respectively. Killing these Shriekers will break the barrier leading to the middle room where Ute is located. But again, we know this is already different in Destiny 2. In any case, from here on out, Ute will shriek in fear and summon more enemies, including some Yellow Bar Ogres. Now, technically speaking, you can just ignore this entirely and go blow your ammo load on Ute and complete the encounter this way. However, the alternate method here is for your fire team to clear out the additional enemies that Ute spawns, which will then trigger a sword bearer to spawn in, kill that sword bearer to obtain a relic sword, and then use the sword on Ute, which will instantly one-shot her and beat the encounter. Last thing I do want to note here is I'm almost certain this encounter had a timer on it. Maybe that's the 390 version of this, not entirely sure, but that might be worth noting and something to look out for in D2 as well. Now we've arrived at the main event, Crota himself. First, keep in mind that it's almost a certainty that something has changed in this fight. It must have, because we will obliterate this encounter otherwise in D2 Sandbox. The encounter begins with your fire team all standing by the ritual crystal, which will then have Crota spawn in and start the fight. While this is happening, the barriers to your left and right are back up now, and enemies have funneled in to meet you. The barriers will drop shortly, and you'll have to fight your way out. Now, assuming that the opening of the fight is intact, you will have a debuff called Presence of Crota, which in simple terms means that you cannot regenerate health normally. Although, with the 8 million ways we have to heal or regen in D2, this might change. The only way to manually heal is to acquire the Chalice of Light, which brings your health back up. The relic can be acquired and passed around to your fire team to regen if needed, though it's crucial that your designated swordbearer ends up with it last. Speaking of which, the main objective to this fight is obtaining a Hive Relic Sword from the swordbearer, as it's the only way to damage Crota in Destiny 1. While the sword is the only thing that can do real damage to Crota, the rest of your fire team can use traditional weapons and break Crota's shield that way. For this to work, your team needs to coordinate, and when they're shooting Crota down the shield, your swordbearer should know when to go in and not rush too early. Otherwise, Crota will just insta-kill you, and in Destiny 2, there is no stealth res, so you're kinda screwed. Once the shield is broken on Crota, though, he will kneel down temporarily, allowing your swordbearer to swoop in and default dance on Crota. I mean, slam Crota with some heavy attacks. Be careful, though. Crota is notorious for breaking animation early, and his kneel timer is already short as is, so don't be too greedy with your sword attacks. Once Crota begins to rise, two things can happen here. First up, the Oversoul will activate. That giant eye in the sky that's been watching the whole raid, yeah, it starts glowing in an attempt to wipe you. Your job here is to damage it enough to break the attack. The second thing that can be happening here is Crota's shield has regenerated, and you can go in for a second coordinated attack to break his shield, so your swordbearer can double dip on damage. If done correctly, you can juggle breaking Crota's shield twice, and then having to deal with the Oversoul to try to maximize your damage. Technically speaking, you can go in for 3 Crota sword kneels before your sword is gone for the swordbearer, but this isn't practical for most teams, and you can get really greedy on this and cause a potential wipe if people are too slow, so just keep that in mind. Once the damage phase is complete, assuming Crota isn't dead, and good god, I hope on contest you don't one-phase him, Crota will then rotate around the room. In Destiny 1, there are only 2 plates he can rotate to, but based on the D2 trailer that we saw, I'm going to assume there will be a 3rd plate he can go to now. Nothing crazy happens here as he does this, he'll just be in a different spot, and you can either attempt to down him there, or wait until he rotates back to the middle position. At this point, you repeat the same process. Find the swordbearer, have your sword player pick up the relic. Once the swordbearer is downed, then get ready for a coordinated attack on Crota. The same pattern applies here as well. Kneel him, and then the Oversoul spawns in. Now, if you have not defeated Crota at this point, there's a little bit of a change in the encounter. Now Crota will rotate again, but this time there will be a Yellow Bar Ogre spawning into the arena from the left and the right Boomer Tower, respectively. these should be taken care of first before planning your next attack. After that, you can repeat the same process with the Sword Bearer. Finally, let's talk about Final Stand. When Crota's health gets too low, somewhere in the 5 to 10% ballpark, Final Stand will initiate, and you will be forced to comply by taking down Crota before the Oversoul takes you all out. Now, technically speaking, you could fight off the Oversoul, but the problem here is it'll keep coming back until you're dead. So the best course of action to take here is to make sure that your damage on Crota is properly scaled to where you will not go into Final Stand at a terrible time where your team isn't ready, or you don't have ammo to take down Crota's shield, or even worse, your Sword Bearer is about to lose his relic due to the timer expiring, because at that point, you might as well be dead. So essentially, try to go into Final Stand with your Sword Relic player having a decent amount of time left on the sword to ensure that he can actually damage in Final Stand. That is, of course, assuming that the sword does the damage on Crota still in D2, which might change, to be honest. But that is the Crota's End Refresher Guide. Like we talked about at the start, things are subject to change. Just bear that in mind going into Crota for Destiny 2. With that said, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you'd like to support the channel, subscribe today, leave a comment or a like to help beat that algorithm. It does help the channel and is much appreciated. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys Friday for the world's first race and beyond. Goodbye.